Thank you. Dear friends in Jesus Christ, this is the second time ever that I moderate a panel discussion, and the very first time that I do it in English. So please pray for me. I'm quite nervous. This morning I have heard two things concerning our panel. The first one was in our morning prayer, that the whole creation is a sign of God's love. It's expressing God's love. And the second one was that when we are talking about changing landscapes, we are not talking only about the nature, but also the culture, the technical things and so on. We Finnish people, we are quite proud and happy about our nature. The tens of thousands of lakes, the pure air, 4 seasons that are so different from each other. But still, we know we have experienced a little bit about the consequences of climate change. And I know that many of you have first-hand experiences about it. Therefore, our topic today is very timely and vital. I will now introduce to you the panelists. First of all, as you can notice, Bishop Sani Ibrahim Azar is not able to be present here. The Evangelical Lutheran Church of Jordan and the Holy Land has asked him not to leave the country as the situation in the area is so tense. But Bishop Azar kindly sent email with the answers for the panel questions. And therefore we have here Anne Heikkinen, who is a doctoral researcher in Helsinki University, Faculty of Theology. And her doctoral dissertation examines theological thinking of Palestinian Bishop Munib Yunan. A couple of years ago, Anne Heikkinen served as a human rights observer with the Ecumenical Accompaniment Program in Palestinian and Israel. And otherwise, she has spent extended periods in both Israel and Palestinian territories since 2019. Anna, welcome to join our panel, and she will be reading the answers of Bishop Azar. Reverend Kusiba Nalvamba has already been introduced, but I would like to point out one thing of her. You have studied and written extensively about the relationship between human and nature from a Christian perspective, but you have reflected in the mirror of African and Asian traditions. Through this, you have also presented various possibilities for doing eco-theology, or should we say theology, from new perspectives. What sparked your interest in this direction, and what are your current key questions in this field?
I think some of it I already mentioned, and it's a reconstruction of that journey. I didn't know that I was being sparked and directed towards the discipline. But when I look back now, I can actually recollect that right from my childhood, my interest in nature, I had wanted to study botany and biology when I went to university, but my maths and physics were not so great. And to go into the School of Natural Sciences, you needed to have that. And so over time, but so when later in life, when I met two scholars who were actually engaged with eco-theology, I felt that that was my entry point. So if you like, in addition to the journey that I described in my earlier presentation, it's also that I met and befriended scholars who were interested in eco-theology, one of whom ended up becoming my PhD, my MA and PhD supervisor. And he was the first person who brought the eco-theology to South Africa as a country, but also to Southern Africa. I met him in the context of the small theological college of my church where I was teaching, and he came to do a symposium, and we got talking. 2 years later, I became his student. But then there was another person who has done extensive work. The name of this first person is Johan Buttendijk, and he happened to have been the dean of the school where I studied at the University of Pretoria. Ernst Conradi, who has written extensively on eco-theology within the Southern Africa context, was another person who really encouraged me in that regard. And I'm saying this to say that human connection is an important dimension to how we get inspired into going on a path. In terms of the question that really interests me, I think the very fact that the eco-theology discipline is a very young discipline, opens up to hermeneutical lenses that are not traditional in our theologizing, has been a very good entry point for me. More recently, I have also become very attracted to the fact that the category of sin is being reclaimed in terms of talking about ecological sin. And so in that regard, I feel that that provides an entry point for Christian discourses to actually make a contribution, not just in constructive theologies, but also diagnostics, if you like, in saying what is fundamentally wrong with our world that manifests itself in ecological destruction, so that we are going beneath the surface.
Okay, thank you. I asked Bishop Azar that as he actually he was born in Lebanon, and we have read about the great cedar forests of Lebanon from pages of the Bible. And many of us know that those forests are almost entirely destructed nowadays. So Bishop Azar has been very active about the environmental questions. And I asked him what inspires him to speak on these issues and work on behalf of his church and region. Please, Anne, would you read?
In the Holy Land, particularly in Palestine, we face numerous and significant challenges, including climate change. In addition, there's significant climate and environmental disruption from the ongoing Israeli occupation, which has lasted for more than 57 years and affects all aspects of life. This is especially evident in the settlement expansion, the alteration of the land inhabitants, and the deforestation, as happened in Abu Ghneim mountain in Jerusalem, near my home in Beit Safafa. The most important natural lung of the Jerusalem and Bethlehem area was removed, and the occupation forces uprooted more than 60,000 trees to build a new settlement called Har Homan. This is just a small example of what has happened. There is also the construction of a long separation wall that has ruined the environment, destroyed biodiversity, and prevented people from accessing their lands, especially Christian families. As a result, some of these families have lost their crops and suffered from fires due to neglect, leading to the emigration of many Christian families who relied on the land for their livelihood from the Holy Land. Indeed, climate change has negatively affected all aspects of life. Over the past 10 years, there have been many indicators of this change, such as irregular rainfall, rapid transitions between winter and summer without a clear spring season, and sharp fluctuations in temperature. Temperatures have risen in the summer, causing many fires, while temperatures have dropped in the winter, affecting plants and their ability to produce. All these issues have a daily impact on human life and even on biodiversity. Since my childhood, the environment has been closely tied to most of the issues I encountered in my daily life. After becoming a bishop in 2018, I became involved with our church's environmental education center that operated under the umbrella of educational work. One of my first decisions was to reorganize this center and elevate its status within the church, making it a center for caring for creation and achieving environmental and climate justice. Since assuming my responsibilities as bishop, I have headed this center, which is important and unique in Palestine and globally due to its affiliation with the church. This entire situation has had a positive impact on me, and I have started many initiatives through which I have sought to strengthen the center's work. Though our environmental situation is incredibly challenging, being able to strengthen the relationship between our Palestinian community, particularly youth, and the land through the center's work inspires me to keep striving for a better future.
Thank you. Our third panelist is Executive Director Riina Nguyen. She has studied to be Orthodox religion teacher. Is it correct? As well. And over the years, she has held various positions of trust in the Finnish Orthodox Church. And currently, she is the Executive Director of Orthodox Church Aid and Missions Philanthropia. Riina Nguyen, thank you for participating in this panel. Welcome. And I found in the work of Philanthropia at least two dimensions that are directly linked with our topic. That means the creation and the daily bread. But I found also that these are not discussed only from the perspective of work done or of the goals, but also they have the spiritual dimension in itself. How do you see this as a Christian and a church member, how this spiritual aspect and the work done are linked together, and what does it mean into your life?
Thank you for the possibility to be discussing these thematics today. Probably a common approach for faith-based non-governmental organizations to this question would focus on Genesis and Matthew 25, but I'm not going to do that. I try another approach to reflect on the relationship between us and God, God's creation and the Creator. And I do this by three aspects: doxologia, Eucharistia, and diaconia. Coming from the Greek words, but we can easily use words in English. We praise God, our Creator. You heard it this morning in the prayers. Many times we said, "Glory to you," and this is what is commonly used in the services in the Orthodox Church. Glory to you, O God, blessed be the kingdom of God. And just we give thanks to God, our Creator, for what we have been given. And we offer it to be blessed by its Creator. And from the spiritual life point of view, this happens in the Eucharist every time in the liturgy. We break the bread and we share it. And we say, or the priest says at that moment, holy gifts to holy people. And the third, diaconia, we serve others and the whole creation. And this is necessary to understand, including the aspect of protecting. So very simple approach: praise, thank, serve, and repeat. Now, to praise, to give thanks, and to serve other people and the whole creation is the way we were created. But the question to our fallen nature as human beings is, do I recognize it in myself? And do I act accordingly? And this is what I try to remind myself daily in my work. The world is not our property, and we are not owned by nature only. We as people and all the nature belong to God. So we as God's creation, we have been given life, existence, to cherish and not to exploit. So this is the approach I would have to my work.
Okay, thank you. Churches are also affected by the climate change and the environmental questions, but how are the environmental issues currently reflected in the life of your church was my next question, and I ask Anne to read the answer of Bishop Hassan.
The Evangelical Lutheran Church in Jordan and Holy Land launched a center 38 years ago to specifically focus on environmental issues. Currently, our center is one of the most important in Palestine, and in cooperation with Church's education department, we have been able to implement many important projects and initiatives. Through dozens of programs, projects, and activities, we work to encourage people to care about the environment and change their behaviors. We started with children, then moved to youth and women, and we hold annual conferences and ongoing meetings that all discuss the environment, its importance, and how we can live sustainably. Solid waste in Palestine is one of the most prominent and significant challenges we face daily. We launched a zero waste initiative in all our Lutheran schools to mitigate the challenge of the daily waste produced there. During the campaign, we distributed 1,500 reusable water bottles and food containers to students, which were well received. This was a wonderful initiative to reduce plastic and waste in these schools, and we have generalized it to various government, private, and honor schools for adoption and replication. We have also built educational plant nurseries and installed solar panels in our schools to generate electricity. This has a significant impact on climate change and environmental protection, as electricity in our region is produced from coal, which is a major pollutant. Producing electricity in our schools through clean energy is a significant way to reduce waste and make a significant contribution to achieving climate justice. We also launched the Tree of Life initiatives to commemorate the victims of the coronavirus pandemic during the 11th Environmental Awareness and Education Conference. We invited those who lost loved ones to the virus in Palestine and the world to plant a native tree in memory of them and to keep their memory alive, and as an open call to prevent the virus by all possible means, and not to underestimate the importance of safety measures, distancing, wearing masks, and more. The initiative was launched on Palestinian Environment Day, 5th of March 2021, and continued until the end of 2021, including planting trees for Palestinians who died from the pandemic in the diaspora. Planting trees represents an important message and contribution to achieving climate justice and an important Christian message of overcoming death with hope and new life.
Thank you. And then Reverend Nalamba.
Thank you. I will speak to the experience within the United Church of Zambia, of which I am a part. I think there's a growing sense of how we need to continue to reflect. So there are a number of theologians and church pastors who have studied and particularly applied their studies to the contexts that I also earlier described, including applying their studies to the environmental impact assessments of the mining area in our country. So at a reflective level, there is a growing sense of taking environmental studies seriously in that regard. But at church level, I think the ecumenical space provides points of interaction. The Oikotree movement, which is an ecumenical body, has inspired some of the congregations. Not all the congregations are involved, but we have an observation of the Oikotree Sunday, where there is a sense of inserting into the liturgy, the care for creation and that sort of thing. So that has got some traction. I also mentioned in my presentation the Southern African Environmental Conservation Institute, SAFSE in short, which is an interfaith platform. It has a peer review dimension to it, and churches opt in to, for instance, have a kind of carbon footprint assessment, that they account for in terms of, use of water, electricity, on a Sunday, or footprint, per week, and there's a mechanism that has been devised around that. But again, this is a small incremental effort that is not every congregation, opts in. Usually it's the urban congregations rather than the rural congregations, and I think that the more affluent congregations who do not really, have the priority of focusing on survival, and as the main focus, tend to be the ones that opt into efforts like this. Tree planting driven by a lot of advocacy groups like NGOs tends to have traction as well, and churches have planned, tend to plan their celebrations of either the harvest season and other liturgical moments around such as this. And so those have become educational for the children, and also as a way of inviting the churches into that space.
Thank you. And what about the Orthodox Church?
How are the environmental issues reflected in the life of my church? I will begin the answer by quoting the head of our church, His Eminence Archbishop Leo of Helsinki and all Finland, because last Sunday he spoke these words in Lapland after liturgy with the local community of Skolt Sami. They are the indigenous people in Finland and Sweden, Norway, and Russia. The Skolt Sami, like many other indigenous peoples, have been pioneers of environmental protection long before the concept came into our consciousness, let alone became fashionable. For centuries, they have cherished their environment, not just for themselves, but for all future generations. Their wisdom springs from a deep connection with nature, and they recognize the threat of climate change more keenly than the rest of us. So if you have the access to this whole speech of his, there is plenty more wise words. In our church, yes, there are many who are worried about the current situation with the climate change, and some Orthodox theologians who study the question and write about it. But I think there is space for more studying and reflecting, especially in praxis. Probably most of the Orthodox who talk about this theme in Finland would refer to His All Holiness Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew as the Green Patriarch, for he frequently talks about these issues. Also a document actually initiated by the Patriarch and is called For the Life of the World. It was produced in 2019. It reflects, among other urgent matters, also on creation and ecology. So, as I said, praxis is another question, and definitely a part that needs more focus and follow-up. Nice words, but then what about after that? The Orthodox Church of Finland approved its first environmental guidelines in 2009, and the Church Council 2023 decided to update them. In my work, we were the first Orthodox organization, at least in Finland, to actually calculate our carbon footprint 2019 and continue to calculate it and find ways to reduce and or compensate it.
Thank you. Reverend Nalvamba, you have done also research on Christian history and history of the mission. How should we respond on the fact that Christian churches and missions have contributed to the exploitation of nature and other peoples in the past?
That's a big question that I think is an entire section within decolonial discourses, and speaks to questions of reparative justice and what that means. But I'll go back first to what I said about the reclaiming of the category of sin. So if the church has been complicit, and as the church has been complicit, what does it mean in terms of that sin category? So I would say repentance is at the beginning. So metanoia is the starting point, but also a retrieval of what is it that was lost. And I think to that extent, I would say the indigenous voices that are coming to the fore and the reclaiming of the cultural hermeneutic, that to a very great extent still remains, close to nature in ways that could call us back to our Christian resources in a more holistic way, is another way of, so the cultural, the stewardship towards cultural preservation and, using cultural lenses of especially those whose, whose epistemologies were not taken seriously in the colonial missionary, enterprise, time. I think we need to think that seriously. So where we talk about eco-justice, I think we also may speak of epistemic justice in that regard. And if there's commitment, to that, as there is certainly within the ecumenical movement, the very notion of mission from the margins, speaks to that, to the fact that, the witness that was once ignored is being centered and becoming instructive to when we ask the question, what is ecumenical missiology? Ecumenical missiology is mission from the margins. In other words, the margins tell us where God's work is at, and we use those lenses. Or when we speak about in the faith and order context within the WCC, we speak about broadening the table, where the conversations in the past tended to be the global north, being around the table, speaking together about matters of faith within the ecumenical space. When we say we broaden the table, we do not just broaden the table. Yes, we broaden it in terms of demographics, but we also broaden it in terms of what are the epistemologies that we are applying in discussing our tenets of faith, and to what extent are these becoming broadened. I think if we go in that direction, we are then, saying the repentance is not just, a single act. It turns us around and calls us back to reclaiming the richness that we do have in the Christian family. And I think that the ecological reformation, has really called us back, to see how if we focus on one dimension, we are the poorer, for it. And if we have a sense of the diversity contributing in various dimensions to these discourses, we are the richer for it.
What you describe is also true here in Finland. As we heard yesterday, we have the indigenous people called Sami in Finland, and I'm looking forward when we are starting to learn from them about the relations with human and nature, but also how their beliefs and how their traditions could modify our way of doing theology.
Yes, I think that that's a very welcome gift. And in July, and Rina is actually a vice moderator of the Commission on Mission and on World Mission and Evangelism. And in July, we were in Nairobi, and we have someone from the Sami community who serves on the commission. And that is where the discourses on mission from the margins are actually taking place. And this is where that contribution is actually being highlighted, because one of the ways that we can reclaim that is actually to have those very voices not being conducted through other people, but they themselves bringing to us as a
exotic.
Exactly, yeah. So it's like an exotic addition, and quite often when we do that, we essentialize the experience. But when the person is able to speak, or the community is able to deliver their gifts, to us, we see them for the full dimension that they're in. So yes, the Sami voice. Even at the assembly we had during the panel on unity and mission, there was a voice from the Sami people. And if the fellowship is taking that seriously, we need to center what is the ecological wisdom that comes from the Sami people who have lived close to the land and close to nature. What do they have to say, about what God is doing in their midst that enriches our way of reflecting?
It seemed to me that you were already ready to continue from here.
Oh, I can at least comment shortly on this topic, that it's also important to understand that not all the indigenous people share the same issues or the same approaches. Depending on where they are living and how their life is affected. We probably come back to these practical examples later in this discussion, so I won't reveal everything yet.
Okay. Is there something that Bishop Azar say about how should we respond on Christian churches' history and?
Then I will add as well.
Yes, sorry. Christian churches and movements have contributed to the legacy of environmental destruction in the past, just as they have contributed to the legacies of religious violence, colonialism, and other negative forces in our world. The most important aspect of reconciling this fact and beginning to correct those past wrongs in the acknowledgement of what our faith has been used to falsely justify, and taking steps to be part of the solution in the future. As the Church has contributed to the environmental harm, it can now be a force for good through education of those in our communities, coalition building with environmental movements within and outside the Church, and taking responsibility for how we impact the earth daily. The Church cannot and should not deny the wrong that has been done historically, but we can be part of the solution now.
Yes.
So if I may add a few examples. I would say have contributed, yes, but we still do contribute to the wrongdoings as churches and mission agencies. Alongside the beautiful teaching about the creation, we must also recognize the false teaching, and when Christians do not behave in the name of love and respect. There are church movements that welcome the climate change as a return to the paradise, the warm and tropical conditions, but I can assure you that people in the Arctic environment do not welcome this as paradise. And I believe the same goes with the many East African countries where, for example, the rains are not what they used to be, there's a lack of them, or they come at wrong times. So, and we see preachers who are teaching things that lead us to cumulative consumption, which is definitely not good for the creation. There are Christians that are focused more on the kingdom to come instead of living actually in the current situation and the world where they should be living as a proclamation and example of their faith. There are churches and clergy that are blessing weapons and which then are targeted to kill people and pollute the land for decades or centuries, and in that sense targeted to destroy God's creation. So how credible is our mission? And how credible are our words of a loving community and Christ's church if we ourselves do not respect creation as God's work? We who are part of the creation.
Okay, it's time to go more on theology. I'd like to ask what have been the most significant discoveries about the relationship between humans and nature? And Reverend Nalwamba, would you start?
I think what has really come to the fore in the reflections is how intricately interconnected everything is. It sounds, very simple, but it's also, I think, it's something that we are rediscovering in very profound ways, and how relationship, lies at the center of how the world is woven together. And so in terms of theological orientation, there's a kind of, within this understanding, pointing back or orientation towards the Trinitarian, theology as such, that fundamentally it's not just a human relation with God, it's fundamentally all of creation being related to God. And so that, I think, for me personally, is something that is very fun, is very profound, and gives me a sense that if we continue to reaffirm, as a way of coming to these discourses as Christians, is going to be, a huge contribution from the Christian standpoint. So I would say at my personal level, this is where, and I think I also see it as a way of connecting with traditions that have always seen life that way. In fact, for most traditional societies, regardless of whether, it's what we were describing, before as those who were marginalized, most traditional societies have a fundamental connection with everything. And so it's a kind of retrieval of that wisdom, in that sense.
And then the answer of Bishop Azar.
Bishop Azar writes, I spent my childhood in an area filled with fruit-bearing trees. These trees were a primary source of my happiness, joy, and peace of mind. Every morning, I would listen to the melodies of nature played by God's small creatures, the birds, which drew me to them. I remember how I used to go and help farmers harvest olives. At the time, I didn't ask about the religion of the field owner. My goal was simply to help from one human being to another. This is what cultivated within me a love for my country, the environment, and a sense of belonging to them. My relationship with nature also facilitated a relationship with my community. As for the religious songs that my mother loved and taught me, there was one in particular. Oh my Lord, how great is existence when I see what your hands have created. We as humans are deeply tied to nature. We are part of it. Our Christian faith is based on love, our love for God and for our neighbors. We have also been given a mandate to preserve and protect God's creation. Our love for God and for our neighbor must extend to the world that we have been given and that we all call home. Striving for environmental justice as a church reflects that responsibility and love. Much of the beautiful environment of my childhood that began my relationship with the nature has been destroyed, replaced by concrete blocks and barbed wire. In this way, the relationship between humanity and nature has been damaged, as humanity exploits and destroys the natural world due to our human-made conflicts. But there is still time to repair this relationship and create a mutual care between nature and humanity that is based on the love of our Christian faith.
Thank you. And Darit Nguyen, what have been your discoveries on this topic?
They're probably not very theological, except in praxis.
It's okay.
Yeah. So I think, first of all, these issues started to come up on my plate when I was a young adult, beginning my theological studies 25 years ago. And I started to kind of connect the ecological thinking and behavior and then the teaching of the creation. So there were many things that were common sense for us living in the eastern Finland, very close to the nature in the countryside, but that were not necessarily obvious in the global context regarding the environmental and climate. And just today, listening to Madame Kazipa, I remembered an experience 20 years ago that was a pilgrimage to the Sami area in Lapland in August. And we visited both in the side of Finland, Norway, and Russia at that time. And of course, most of the pilgrimage was lovely spiritual experience with prayers and meeting people, being in the nature. Then we visited the town of Nikkel in Russian Lapland. Name comes from the mine of nickel there. And it was not so paradise because the people, average age was 50, and the very fragile nature of Lapland was covered with gray and black dust. It was practically dying. So these kind of experiences of when you are, let's say, being connected to the nature, but then at the same time destroying it. That was one experience. But I think for many of us who still have some space to be in the nature, that's not obvious everywhere in the world, where the nature is kind of being destroyed or the forests are being cut. Most of the Europe has already experienced that there are not so many forests anymore. You are also losing healing space where to kind of reconnect and find peace.
Thank you. I think that we Lutherans, we are sometimes too attached in Reformation time and the Reformation way of doing theology. I don't say that it's bad, but sometimes we don't see all the issues that should be reflected. What would you hope from the theological work of churches concerning our topic?
I would borrow the word reformation, an ecological reformation. I would hope that since this issue is challenging us to the core, that we go back, to the core beliefs, but also let them, challenge us in terms of how we are church, the very fundamental understanding of what the church is. And I will again, borrow from what you said about, how do the questions that arise from this crisis address our liturgical spaces? What is it that we are doing in our liturgies to, begin to reinforce, what, the message ought to be, the reorientation or the repentance from the past, complicity and, the reconnecting, with creation in a more meaningful way. What about proclamation of the good news? What does that do in terms of, if you use a Greek word, the kerygma, what is it that we are preaching in our churches that connects, thematically with this? In terms of mission, materia, what is our witness? How, is that reforming? What about the diaconia, the services that we provide? How are they reconnecting, with that? The very upbuilding and formation of, the church spaces, how is it, that this theme is connected to that? What is it that we are radically changing because, this is a radical issue that takes us back to our roots. What is it that we are learning anew that is filtering into church practice and, something that will become, part of our catechism, of, reorienting, us, to that. So if you ask me, my hope is that we can, have, that sense of, going back to our roots in terms of Christian teaching, but also looking at it, through the new lenses and seeing, the incremental transformation of, the various ministries of our church. That's the only way that we can account for it. So hopefully, maybe I'm a Lutheran at heart, having spoken about Reformation.
And it would be interesting to see the churches around the world to do the new catechisms from their perspective, not only from the one perspective. Yeah. Please.
Okay.
Nguyen.
I think in this one I'll be short. To some extent I will refer to the General Secretary who yesterday said that it's a mess. And it is a mess. But that's why it means also that we kind of have to balance on how much we talk about or stay in the abstract level of theology and how much we actually start focusing on the practical side. What does it mean in practice when we go to the community and start thinking, okay, what are we doing completely wrong here now? And how should we divert to different ways of doing? So at the minimum, I hope that we do find a common ground, at least the minimum that we can agree on the theology and on creation, but then seriously taking the steps, okay, how do we change things? And this demands courage, courageous people, but also showing the example, not only in the preaching, in the sermons, and in video material or anything in the social media, but really starting to make the big changes. Even just calculating your footprint, you realize where you go wrong.
Yes, and then Bishop Azar.
According to Azar, as Christians, we believe that we all have received a mandate to care for creation. What this looks like for churches can vary based on our environmental situations. For all of us, caring for creation can mean limiting our negative impacts on the natural world while educating our communities about ways to solve our environmental issues. As Azar mentioned earlier, our environmental situation is impacted significantly by the ongoing occupation. For us, caring for creation also means strengthening our community's relationship with the environment, especially when it comes to the students' groups. We want Palestinian children and youth to feel a sense of stewardship over their land, which can be difficult due to settlement expansion and resource draining. Our church, and particularly our environmental center, work to educate students on native biodiversity and encourage them to care for the earth despite these challenging circumstances. My goal is that our theological work brings hope to our people amidst times of hardship. Part of this hope is for a more just and sustainable future of life on our hand. Caring for the earth is a significant part of this theological call that allows for a safe and secure future for generations to come.
Thank you. In your keynote, you emphasized on contextuality, and you brought up the value of different cultures and local cultures. How should we reflect the environmental issues locally? Now we have much been talking about the global idea or the universal church acting, but what does it mean locally in local contexts?
it's a big question. What it means, I think, in local context is that we take seriously, the fact that the experience of different communities, is that just, different. And so that sense of we might have, the universal, idea of what is going on. I just give an example of, the justice question. Like in ecological, theological terms, people are thinking in terms of the Anthropocene, as in human beings are responsible for the damage, within creation, which is a true statement. But within that, we have to think about, the power deconstruction and the power levels. So within a particular community, there will be the privileged and the not so privileged who might suffer more greatly, the consequences, of the climate issues at an international level in the same way. So I would say, being true to the local context, means that we diagnose, more accurately, how, the particular context, relates to its environmental issues, but also what the solutions would be. Because I find that when we universalize, we also universalize the solutions. Mm-hmm. And so the universalization of solutions, I think, takes us back to not taking seriously, the cultural distinctiveness, that we spoke about. And within cultures as well, it's not to say once we have learned about, let's say, the African context, there's a single narrative about that. There are very many different narratives, and there are very many layers of power relations that needs to be deconstructed, internally as well. So I think, in my view, the locality of the context should not be taken in isolation from the universal. There has to be a back and forth and a sense of the intertwined nature of, how connected we are. I think we live in a very globalized, environment, so that even where, we might see pristine environments like in this country, there has to be thinking about, to what extent is, the economic power of Finland, for instance, projected in ways that are complicit, to, let's say, mining, contamination, in certain parts of the world. And what does that call, the Christian family, to, in terms of, the work of mission that we do? It may well be that we are connected to a community whose area is being polluted, by, our national interests. And so that sense of understanding of the web, I think, needs to be, very clearly, articulated. And to that extent, I think the World Council of Churches, as the broadest platform, of churches, has thinking that dates back from very far in the 80s, in the integrity of creation, has been a perpetual theme. And there have been many discourses that have come out of that, including just, at the Karlsruhe Assembly, climate justice, came through as one of the major issues. And I think in the General Secretary's keynote yesterday, we heard about that. And so how we bring this to the fore in terms of, what is true contextually, and how it relates to the church family at a broader level, and how we can be mutually accountable for what is happening both globally and locally, I think, is an important dimension of our work. And if it's going to be ecumenical in spirit, it needs to take that into account.
In Finland, we saw this local and national level in a way when a couple of years ago one of our pastors wrote an article or column about the rights of animals, and it burst out a very vivid discussion in social media, because the farmers and those who have cattle had a little bit different point of view. Maybe there was some misunderstandings also, but it showed how differently people view these questions. I'd like to ask Reverend Heikkinen to read Bishop Azar's response.
Our message as Christians is strongest when we join our voices together. Our voice in our communities can be strengthened by working with organizations that understand our context, and those can be broaden our understanding of the church environmental mission globally. Our church, especially our environmental center, works through the World Council of Churches as part of the working group on climate change. We also work through the ACT Alliance in the Middle East and North Africa to generalize important experiences in preserving creation, protecting environment, and achieving environmental and climate justice. This allows us to focus our environmental work on how climate change and climate injustice is experienced by those in our community specifically. We are trying to do more by developing our cooperation with the Lutheran World Federation on many environmental programs, and to be an example for the world of how to care for the environment even in the harshest and most difficult conditions. In this way, our environmental mission is meant to inspire and empower our communities to form connections with and protect our natural resources however we can, keeping in mind that for us it is part of the larger mission for justice.
Thank you. How would you encourage us, and maybe especially the younger generation, because these questions are so large, they are so important, so they are so touching, but sometimes, actually we heard yesterday how some, especially the young people, are depressed or having even mental problems because they don't see the future. We read from the Old Testament, Prophet Jeremiah said in the chapter 29, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." But on the other hand, Jesus said, "When the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth?" On my view, there is a tension here between concern and hope. Could you please encourage us?
Creation given as a gift from God, who lovingly, nurtures it and gives it to us as a gift, I think would be a good starting point. When we start with the diagnosis of where we are at, it tends to be doom and gloom. The Christian message is good news. And so without diminishing where we are at, I think it would be good to have a theology that celebrates creation as a gift, and hopefully that is captured in mediums that young people relate to. Because I think the doom and gloom story has overtaken the good news. Mm-hmm. But to the young people in particular, what I would say is to get to know the Christian faith in a deeper way, and to continue on that path, and to see it as the lens that they bring to the activism. At Karlsruhe, we had a very strong voice of young people on the question of climate justice, and rightly so, because they are the generation whose future is being squandered. And so the sense of desperation about that, the sense of concern, is merited. But I think getting to know what the Christian values, the beliefs, and the tenets of faith that anchor us is exactly how we would bring a Christian contribution to this question. Otherwise, we are just one activist movement that is saying the same thing. But I think there's a Christian message that would uplift that sense of celebration despite where we are at, but also fuel our energy into contributing in that meaningful way. So for young people, I would say kudos for the energy, kudos for joining, the activism, but please undergird it with a sense of, deep faith and an understanding in a comprehensive way of what, the Christian fundamental beliefs are as your anchor.
Thank you. And then, Heikkinen, please.
Indeed, without hope as part of our Christian faith, we cannot continue in our belief. Christianity compels us to hope for the future. And indeed, we face great challenges through wars and conflicts in the region, especially the recent genocide in Gaza, which has involved extensive environmental destruction. We face great challenges, but through our faith, our hope is strong that this ordeal will end and all people will obtain their rights to freedom and liberation from injustice. Climate justice is a part of that liberation. We have hope that through justice, we can create a world where humans live in their environments with dignity and sustainability. It's true that it is difficult for us now to talk about the environment amidst destruction and ruin, but this real threat is also an opportunity and hope to prove the legitimacy of our concern for our environment from the machinery of war and destruction and from humanity's destruction of our environment with our own hands. Our environment is our present and our future, and it deserves our protection. The majority of people who interact with our environmental education center are part of the younger generations. When I see their curiosity about, excitement for, and love of the land we call home, I feel intense hope for the future of our planet. The younger generation has the power to transform the way we interact with the world and to create a more just relationship between humanity and the environment and humanity and each other.
Thank you. And then, Riina Nguyen.
Oh, actually, I have 2 teenagers, so to encourage them, I think I would tell them that make sense, avoid nonsense. That creation is not something static that happened a long time ago and then is fatalistic. It's creative work of God, and the communion of God continues every day. Every morning we wake up. Use this creativity every day. And be thankful for the human capacity that you can learn and heal, and that also learnings in the science can help us in this work. That's also a gift to protect the nature. And you said also about the hopelessness, about the youth.
Yes.
Yeah, to remind that they are not alone. We are here. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. I warmly thank you, panelists, Reverend Nalvapa, Director Nguyen, and Reverend Heikkinen, but also Bishop Azar. And thank you for your prayers. The panel will end now, and we are moving towards the midday prayer. But before that, the stream will be shut down now, and we are going to practical information.